It's My Nerd World, a Star Wars show. And on this week's episode, my review of Rebel Moon. It's not Star Wars. It was supposed to be Star Wars. And then Zack Snyder went and made it something entirely different. I will share with you my thoughts. Plus, Dave Filoni teases a Thrawn and Hera showdown. And we'll get to your listener feedback this week. Merry Christmas to you. I hope you're having a fantastic holiday, and thank you so much for checking out the episode again this week. Remember, if you want to support My Nerd World, this episode is brought to you by My Nerd World and the science fiction space opera series EMBARK. After Earth faces its end, follow pilots Taft and Katha and their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. 7 books in all in the series, available on Amazon.com or MyNerdWorld.net. Talk a little bit more about that after this week's show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My Nerd World.
Just let it in.
Welcome to it. I'm your host, Jon Justice, here on a Star Wars show. And again, Merry Christmas to you. I hope you're having a fantastic holiday. I am on vacation, thankfully, but I wanted to get in at least one more show before the end of the year, provided we don't get any Star Wars news between now and January 1st. There's still some rumors floating around that there's potentially some Star Wars news that is out there in the ether that has yet to be announced. Given the fact that we are now a few days away from Christmas, not in the middle of a week, I'm thinking that we're not going to get anything major before the end of the year. But if something does pop up, I'll certainly put together a show to talk about it a bit. So I've been doing my own Star Wars watching, as I do quite often. Just got done with another watch of The Empire Strikes Back. I'm planning on watching the sequel trilogy while I'm on my vacation, and decided, you know what? I want to watch Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi heading into watching the sequels. I only bring that up because there's some similarity with The Empire Strikes Back and Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, which just debuted on Netflix. The Empire Strikes Back does it much better than Rebel Moon. And what I'm talking about is the story. The story in the Empire Strikes Back I thought was always interesting because it's a story, but it's kind of a shell of a story. The Empire Strikes Back puts our characters through their paces, but when you look at the way the story plays out, it really is a middle chapter of this trilogy, and it doesn't have your typical MacGuffin to go after. Not like A New Hope, and certainly not like Return of the Jedi. It is a definitive middle chapter that requires both the front and back-end storytelling in those two movies of A New Hope and Return of the Jedi. Rebel Moon, unfortunately, being the first of two movies, suffers from kind of a weak story. And that's the part of Rebel Moon that I had the hardest part with. It left me with similar feelings after watching The Empire Strikes Back, especially for the first time being a kid, and that is, well, I really need to see the next chapter. That certainly is the case for Rebel Moon. I'm really looking forward to seeing part 2, but unfortunately for Rebel Moon, whereas The Empire Strikes Back is one of the greatest Star Wars movies ever made, Rebel Moon kind of feels like it falters at the end and doesn't deliver on a single story in part 1. So let's get into a bit of this, and we'll back up a little bit. Zack Snyder of Sucker Punch fame, he ended up doing the Watchmen. Of course, there is the DC movies that he was responsible for. The Justice League, certainly the Snyder cut, and not the one that was all chopped up that was originally released in theaters. You had a Man of Steel, which I'm a big fan of. You had the Batman versus Superman, of which the director's cut is much better than the original theatrical version. I enjoy Zack Snyder's films. The aspects of Zack Snyder's filmmaking that I don't gravitate towards is usually the more egregious and explicit material that he puts within his films. It's not in all of it, but there are scenes within Watchmen, a lot of sex in Watchmen, and other stories that he's told. And apparently there is supposed to be there will be a Rebel Moon R-rated version, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and how, based off of what I got in the PG-13 version of Rebel Moon, I have no desire at all to see the R-rated version. So, just as a setup, I like Zack Snyder. I think he's a really talented filmmaker, and I was genuinely excited about this story. Originally, Zack Snyder had written Rebel Moon to be a Star Wars film, and had actually at one point spoke with Lucasfilm. My understanding was this was prior to the sale of Lucasfilm to Disney, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that, but I seem to recall when Rebel Moon was announced that Zack had pitched this prior to Disney selling it, or Disney buying Lucasfilm from George Lucas. Now, this may have happened right after the sale. Either way, Lucasfilm wasn't interested in this story, so Zack Snyder shelved it until a point in time where he could retool it and have it become its own thing, its own space opera. For that, I was really excited. One of the concerns that I had early on was that it was being billed as an R-rated Star Wars, of which I didn't personally have any desire to see. That being said, when the production started rolling along and we got more details about this film, we found that it would be in two parts. There would be two different versions, a PG-13 version, as I mentioned, and an R-rated version. Then I got a little bit more excited, and as we got more information and the trailers, I was genuinely hyped up for this movie and these movies. Having watched Rebel Moon this week, I can say that I was entertained, but ultimately, as I mentioned, I was left wanting part two, having watched what didn't feel like a completed story. I found myself at the end of the film constantly pausing to look at how much time we had left because I was surprised that we had reached the end. Though the pacing was fine for a movie that is 2 hours and 15 minutes long. At no point did I get bored watching the film, but ultimately, by the time we got to the end, I felt a bit like we didn't really get that far. It was a small story acting like a big story. It had a big budget look, but with a low budget feel. As I was watching it, I'm thinking, this looks great, and it's definitely Zack Snyder, no doubt about that. The costume work was good. I'll talk a little bit more about the vehicles coming up in just a moment. The locations were fine. A few of them felt a little redundant. They were on the moon at the beginning of the film, in which it had a sort of a dull, tan look to it, even though it had some foliage. They go to another planet. It's all desert. It all had this vibe of when you have a low-budget science fiction film and they head to locations that look otherworldly, but typically they just look like deserts, right? So, again, it had this big-budget look, but still this low-budget-esque feel. The final battle in the movie, again, had me looking at the runtime and questioning it, as if to say, oh, we're building up to this finale, which is just a fight on a floating space dock. When we got to that part of the movie, I was like, oh, this is what we've been building up to this whole time? Okay. It just felt a little flat. And maybe that had to do with my own expectations. Considering this was going to be, or this is a space opera, I was kind of expecting it to play out typically as, space operas do, where you end up at the end of certainly the first opening act and you have sort of a rather large confrontation and space battle. And this just felt very small and more akin to an action sequence that you would find at the beginning of a film, not certainly at the end of the film. Now, that being said, the gunfights were good. I was borderline on, and the film was borderline on slow motion overuse. It's one of the trademarks of Zack Snyder. He does a lot of slow motion. He always has. You go all the way back to 300 and Sucker Punch and the DC movies. In Rebel Moon, I enjoyed it and didn't think that it was overdone. I felt like it was almost overdone. Like maybe there were one or two shots that simply didn't need to go into slow-mo, but be that as it may, I'm at this point really nitpicking, and if the story had been more solid and had built up to a better finale, I probably wouldn't have brought up the potential of the slow-motion overuse at all. Ultimately, I wanted more space in this space opera. I enjoyed the times when we got out into space and we were traveling from planet to planet, and the special effects were awesome. All of the space flight sequences and the traveling were good, but we never ended up with that very typical space opera big battle, space battle sequence. And maybe that's coming in part 2. They showed a trailer for part 2, which will be out in April, and it was clear that, okay, it looks like part 2 is where we're going to be getting all of the battles. You know what it really reminded me of now that I think about it? And I feel like this movie did a much better job. It feels like watching Dune. And that is the most recent Dune film that came out. Denis Villeneuve, the director, took the Dune book and he basically cut it in half. So what we got was Dune Part 1, and then coming up next year after having been delayed because of the writer's strike, next year we'll end up getting Part 2. And Part 2 is essentially going to be a war movie. The story leads up into this other part. If you read it as a whole, it makes a lot more sense. But when you're seeing it split up, the end of Dune kind of, I don't want to say landed flat, I enjoyed it, but again, you had the big battle taking place more at the middle part of the film, and then at the end was a scaled down hand-to-hand combat fight before the film wrapped up. Now, Rebel Moon had a slightly larger fight, but again, in terms of it being the finale, I felt like it really landed flat. The aesthetic that Zack Snyder created was okay. It was very typical Zack Snyder. None of the vehicles grabbed me. I liked the Empire dreadnought ships. Looked a bit like a battleship in space. I thought that was unique and different. But overall, I felt that the ships themselves were really lacking in terms of their design work. Zack Snyder has a very specific look when he makes his films as it relates to the technology. And it just doesn't quite land for me. It's absolutely set apart from other franchises, and certainly Star Wars. There's no mistaking that these vehicles are not in the Star Wars universe. But not a single one of the ships had me wanting a physical version sitting on my desk. I got kind of excited when we saw some smaller fighters that belonged to the rebel group as they were trying to compile a group of individuals to go back to their home planet to defend it from the Empire. And again, it's a smaller story kind of acting like a bigger story. But then we really didn't get to see any of those smaller ships in action, and none of them really did much of anything for me. And again, those are the aspects of space operas that I enjoy. The bar scene towards the beginning of the film was too adult for for me personally. The concepts and the aliens were interesting, but as Zack Snyder tends to do, it all got a little bit too pervy for me. It felt like the Xerxes Palace encampment scene from 300, wherein 300, that made a lot more sense. The debauchery that was taking place, among the minions for Zerk Season 300. While graphic, okay, at least from a storytelling standpoint, it kind of made sense. And this made sense, too, in terms of setting the scene in this bar, which was clearly kind of reminiscent of what we got on Tatooine. But this being a PG-13 Zack Snyder film, and again, we're getting an R-rated version of this. There were just moments during the entirety of all the confrontations taking place in this bar scene where they end up meeting the individual who has the ship that can take them to the planets to go find these rebels that they need to go and defend their planet. Again, it just got all a little bit too explicit and pervy for me, which, you know, gives me no desire to watch the R-rated version at all, because I suspect that what was removed from the R-rated version to make it PG-13 was going to be an abundance of explicit sex scenes, and that's just something that I don't personally need in my science fiction. So that being said, I am perfectly fine with the PG-13 version. I am curious about the R-rated version only because Zack Snyder has said himself that it is a completely different movie in his mind, and it kind of, the worlds are set apart from the PG-13 version. And again, I think it's all going to be focused around explicit content, because there was even some dialogue alluding to that at the beginning of the film before the Empire arrives on our hero's planet, when they're talking about the celebration and the way that everybody will celebrate that night. This is a personal issue for me. If you don't have any problem with that type of content and explicit content, then it probably won't bother you at all. But just for me, it got a little bit too weird and took me out, and I didn't find that all that enjoyable. Part 2, again, looks much more entertaining, having now dispensed with the 2-hour plus setup of Child of Fire. I was really excited by the first third of the movie and was anticipating a ramp up of intensity that just simply never came throughout the rest of the film. So ultimately, I give Rebel Moon 3 out of 5 stars. I was thinking more 3.5, but I'm going to go 3 out of 5. I will give it a rewatch and see if my view of it changes. It could have been simply because I was so excited for it that my expectations were too high, and potentially because of that, it tainted my overall view of what this was supposed to be, and perhaps on a rewatch, I might feel a little bit differently. A good example of this would be The Creator. The Creator was a film that I was one of my most anticipated films of the year, and when I walked out of the theater and in the middle of watching it, it wasn't quite working for me on a number of levels. And having now watched it a second time on Blu-ray, I enjoyed it much more than I did the first time around. Now that I've already been past and I knew, now that I've already watched it once, I knew what to expect, and I was able to kind of relax and sit back and watched it. I went, oh man, I really enjoyed this movie a lot more than I did that first time around. So again, it could have just been my own hype level for the film, and it didn't quite match my enthusiasm for it. So we'll see. I'll give it a second watch and come back and share with you my thoughts. I would like to hear from you, though, so feel free to drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment up on YouTube, and I'm happy to share those on the next My Nerd World episode.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
All right, let's get to official Star Wars news. At the start of 2023, nobody knew we were getting a live-action Thrawn in Star Wars. And this comes from Star Wars Newsnet. But at Star Wars Celebration, Dave Filoni unveiled the big news that not only was the Grand Admiral, so beloved for various canon and legend novels, and from Star Wars Rebels, stepping into Ahsoka, but he would be played by Lars Mikkelsen, the very voice actor who brought his menacing, whispering tones to the Rebel animated series. Now, Thrawn is back, and he's back in the main Star Wars galaxy and ready to cause chaos for the New Republic. As for what his plan actually entails, Dave Filoni teased a few hints of what comes after his return from exile. Of course, Dave Filoni, and again, this is actually from Empire, not Star Wars Newsnet, so my bad. This comes from Empire Magazine. And for those that aren't familiar, Dave Filoni is kind of the heir to George Lucas. He was trained under George Lucas during the creation of the Clone Wars animated series, and has carried on in a producer role now for all the years that Disney has been working with Lucasfilm, and has actually now been elevated to more of a chief creative officer within Lucasfilm. So he will be in charge of the storytelling in all aspects of Star Wars content creation. Speaking to Empire Magazine for their year in review for 2023, in a piece all about Thrawn's glorious comeback, Dave Filoni mentioned the character introduced towards the end of Mandalorian Season 3 in that mysterious Shadow Council sequence. He said, "We set up Captain Filoni in The Mandalorian, and that's a character that goes with Thrawn, so I'd love to see the two of them together," Filoni teases. Plus, he points out, a fellow figure from Ahsoka has a long-standing conflict with the Grand Admiral. His foil through Rebels was Hera, Filoni states. Pitting the two generals against one another is something that I find interesting. We could be in for an almighty clash of blue versus green. Now, Lars Mikkelsen himself has some thoughts of what Thrawn is ultimately setting out to do. Straightening out all the others to tidy up the shop, he says. I could imagine something in terms of a power play within the Empire. The New Republic needs to buckle up. The Empire remnant is preparing to strike back. I've mentioned many times on the show, and I will continue to say, that I loved Ahsoka. I just finished another rewatch of the series, and I like what Ahsoka is doing in setting up this interim story as we move forward in the timeline toward the sequel trilogy. The anticipation is that the Ahsoka storyline, the upcoming Mando Season 4 storylines, eventually with Skeleton Crew, this is all going to culminate in a Dave Filoni-directed film, which I anticipate will ultimately bring about the rise of the First Order. And what I really appreciate about the storytelling that we're getting with Ahsoka and what we're doing in the Mandoverse timeline heading into the sequel trilogy is that in terms of scale, it has big galaxy implications, but we're still telling a smaller story, and it's very reminiscent of the original trilogy, where we're tracking this small group of rebels that are engaged in this small group of people, telling a very personal story, but still engaged in a wider galactic conflict, where these altercations, these battles are taking place that have massive, massive ramifications, but still with the number of characters that we can track. And here we have this threat emerging that never needs to get full-blown into taking over the galaxy. It just needs to stress the New Republic to a point where they're vulnerable, so that when the First Order arrives, they're in a better position to become the major galactic threat. Another way to put this is the story doesn't feel wedged into place. It feels very appropriate for the decades between Return of the Jedi and the sequel trilogy. And it seems poised to be able to fill in the blanks of, okay, how did we end up getting the First Order? What is Snoke been doing? We have some of those answers in The Rise of Skywalker, but those will be furthered here. We've had the seeds that have been laid out as it relates to cloning and what Moff Gideon was attempting to do in The Mandalorian. I imagine behind the scenes and in the Lucasfilm storytelling, they've got all this mapped out in much more detail than what we as fans believe. There's always been so much criticism surrounding modern Star Wars, Disney, Disney Star Wars, and certainly the sequel trilogy of they didn't have a plan, they didn't have a plan. And I'm not going to go over that ground again as it relates to the sequel trilogy. I've covered that plenty of times on the show. And whereas maybe they didn't have all the lines connected and things changed throughout the course of the storytelling process, as we talked about on last week's show with Adam Driver saying that Kylo Ren was eventually supposed to end up bad, I imagine that what we're seeing laid out now with the Mandoverse, Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, they've got a pretty good idea of where all this is going. And they're doing a really, really good job of laying this story out so that it will have the consistency and hopefully avoid the criticism of the fandom like we've seen so many times of they didn't have a plan. To that point, MakingStarWars.net and Bespin Bulletin reported this week that the Rangers of the New Republic show that was announced all those years ago during one of the investors' meetings when we had Kathleen Kennedy out there telling us all of the different Star Wars content we were going to be getting, and we've only gotten a few of those. According to Bespin Bulletin and Jason Ward over at MakingStarWars.net, most of what was supposed to entail Rangers of the New Republic seems to have been rolled into The Mandalorian and Ahsoka. There was a lot of speculation that Rangers of the New Republic would be revolving almost solely around Gina Carano's character of Cara Dune, and it turns out that was not the case. Rangers of the New Republic was always supposed to be how there were a group of individuals keeping an eye on this emerging threat, Thrawn being the main catalyst of that, and the New Republic continually not adhering to their calls of concern, thus putting the New Republic in a vulnerable position. And that certainly seems to be the case of what we've been getting in not only some of the storytelling of The Mandalorian, but also in what we got in Ahsoka, specifically in the majority of the Hera scenes in the latter part of the Ahsoka series, and her meetings that she had with the New Republic and their reluctance to take her concerns seriously. So we'll continue to watch all this and see how it plays out. Still no word on when Ahsoka Season 2 could be coming. We did get confirmation, although we don't have dates yet, that we will be getting Skeleton Crew, The Acolyte, along with Bad Batch Season 3, right? And Tales of the Jedi Season 2, all coming next year, even though we don't have dates for any of those. Oh, and I believe that Andor Season 2 is also on deck for next year as well, and they don't have a date attached to it. But certainly, as soon as we get a date here on this show, I will be more than happy to share it with you. In the meantime, let's get to some of your listener feedback this week.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Princess Cupcakes writes in, based off of last week's episode, if he had never been redeemed, Han's death would have been for nothing, speaking of Kylo Ren and Ben Solo. So I'm glad they went with redemption and the dyad, even though it seems they didn't want to totally commit to any storyline in that trilogy, except for Rey being the hero, of course. In the end, I wish that they had gone with George's story for the sequels. Merry Christmas, John. And Merry Christmas to you, Princess Cupcakes, and thank you for the email this week. ZBH writes, Kylo also started out as a General Grievous type character in the first version of The Force Awakens. I don't know why anyone makes a big deal about story plans changing. Both of these changes were for the better, in my opinion. Yeah, I tend to agree with you, and as I've mentioned before, I just miss the moments in I miss it when fandom didn't have as much information as they have now. I guess that's what I mean to say. I think we were all better off when we didn't have all the details of every little thing that took place behind the scenes. Typically, we got that stuff, but it was much later after the productions were done. And even then, those were things just talked about amongst our friends, but we didn't really dwell on them. Now we just have an abundance of content that gets created because people can go and make money off of it, and so it's not not a huge surprise when the discussions surround the production of it, when we don't have anything of storytelling, we don't have storytelling aspects to go and discuss. All right, listen, that wraps up the show for this week, and that wraps up this year's worth of shows. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do appreciate it. I hope that you enjoy listening as much as I do recording these. I still love Star Wars, and I'm really excited for the new content we're going to be getting. I wish that Rebel Moon had delivered more, because I believe there's a space out there for space opera content that can be filled and do something different than Star Wars, but still meeting the expectations of space opera fans like myself. And I had hoped that Rebel Moon would be that, and it just turned out that it kind of wasn't. So we'll see how part 2 plays out. In the meantime, if you want to check out space opera that's not in the Star Wars universe, that's why I wrote my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. 7 books in all in the series, available on Kindle Unlimited for free, on ebook, audiobook, hardcover, and paperback. And you can purchase those hardcover and paperbacks directly from me as well. The description for book 1 of the EMBARK series is as follows. It's 2172 when flight culture has replaced car culture. 2 rival megacorporations, D-Corp and Enercon, have made interstellar travel possible and spaceflight available to the masses. Taft Guardia spends his weekends at an abandoned flying field, training with his squadron of pilot friends and the woman he longs to be with, Keith Amaro. After receiving a cryptic message from her late-aerospace engineer father, they embark on a perilous journey, unaware that an industrial accident is about to set off an apocalyptic chain of events. As the ruthless Sint Argum of D-Corp attempts to exploit the disaster and seize control, Taft and Keitha are thrust into the middle of humanity's fight for survival when they discover what may be the only hope of stopping D-Corp's evil leader. Prepare for an action-packed thrill ride that will take you from Earth to the far reaches of the galaxy. So, support my nerd world. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction. Written for adults, but great for ages 11 plus. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today in ebook or paperback, hardcover, or audiobook. And again, if you want to purchase the paperbacks or hardcovers directly from me, just email talkshownerd@gmail.com. It's cheaper in terms of shipping, a little bit cheaper in terms of the cover price as well, and I'll even sign them for free. But I hope you'll check out my science fiction space opera series. I wrote this series because of my love of science fiction, space opera, and Star Wars. I wanted to create a series of stories that matched what I would want to see as a science fiction space opera fan were I to go to the movies today to watch a film that wasn't Star Wars. That was the intent of writing these. And so they really do read like a movie. So treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction. Again, it's great for ages 11 plus, even though I wrote it for adults. But in terms of content, there's no language and no explicit content whatsoever. Just the typical action that you would see like you would when you go and watch any Star Wars film or read a Star Wars book. Again, available on Amazon.com or at mynerdworld.net. I hope you'll go and pick up your preferred copy and support My Nerd World and the podcast that I do here. And you'll get something out of it. Some really fun nonstop action, a little bit of romance as well. A lot of cool science fiction tech, all in an epic space opera storytelling over the course of 7 books. I hope you have a Merry Christmas. I hope you have a fantastic New Year and an even better 2024 than you did a 2023. I also hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. I'll talk to you in the new year. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Talk to you then. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.